Welcome to this episode of Q&A with Liturgy Man. I'm Taylor Burton-Edwards, Liturgy Man with Discipleship Ministries of the United Methodist Church. I'm your apportionment dollars at work to help you strengthen worship and the understanding of worship where you are. Today's question comes to us from Nadine Godwin of Little Rock, Arkansas, who wonders why United Methodists tend not to have altar calls in their worship services, at least as she has experienced that where she is in Arkansas. Well, let me first of all say there are still plenty of places in the United Methodist Church where you might actually see an altar call, where there is an opportunity to respond to the work of the Holy Spirit, much as you might have thought about it happening in the revivals, in camp meetings, and those kinds of settings in the 19th century. But they're not everywhere. In fact, in my experience, kind of moving around the connection worldwide, I'd say those kinds of things are the exception rather than the rule for how worship tends to go. So why is that? Well, I propose the answer to that question is reflected in the fact that we actually never had altar calls as part of our official ritual in the United Methodist Church or its predecessors until the 1935 Methodist hymnal that brought together the North, the South, and the Methodist Protestant Church. That's the very first time that our official ritual actually includes anything quite like an altar call for Sunday morning, a definitive action opportunity for people individually to respond to the Word. And it comes in the form that it still is listed in our hymnal as an option today, as an invitation to Christian discipleship that follows the sermon. What I'd like to say is that even though it's first introduced in 1932, even there it's not clear what it's supposed to be. There's no description of exactly what's involved in that invitation to Christian discipleship. Even in the more expansive version of the services that occur in the 1945 Book of Worship that elaborate on what happens here, there's no explanation of what that's for. It's just simply listed as a thing, which basically says we want there to be some kind of response to the Word. Maybe in places that have been used to the revivalism of the 19th century, that might be or look like an altar call. In other places, it might look like something else. We get a much more explicit clue that that might in fact be what was going on beginning in 1932 through 1945, actually not from the Methodists at the time, but from the EUB Church in the EUB hymnal of 1957, which includes an invitation to Christian discipleship right after the sermon, and then describes here, as the Methodists never did, what it actually means to do an invitation to Christian discipleship. Here's what it says, though. An appeal for decision or action, some practical project may be suggested. So in some ways, it's kind of a little bit more like what early Methodists were doing with inviting people to come to sign up, as it were, for a trial class meeting, rather than an invitation to Jesus, to give your heart to Christ on the spot, the whole sort of anxious bench revivalist trope. That really isn't what's being described in what's happening here. It's an appeal for decision or action. Some practical project may be suggested. So again, there was this sort of maybe a bit of resistance to letting what happens in revivals or even field preaching be the same thing that happens on Sunday morning worship, because it was never part of the ritual prior to that. Finally, not yet finally, in 1966, in the 65 Book of Worship, we see the invitation to Christian discipleship maybe waning a bit more, because now there's a statement about the hymn that follows it as this may be a recessional hymn. So it's not even clearly an invitational hymn. And then finally, in our current Book of Worship, in page 24, which describes the things that can happen as part of that movement of response to the Word, it says, this should include an invitation to Christian discipleship, followed by a hymn of invitation. Or, and then it goes on to list 3 or 4 other things in that paragraph, and then 9 more below it. So it's sort of like whatever's going to happen after the sermon, we want some kind of response to the Word, But this idea of an altar call as the way that happens, as the means of response, is being sort of buried in 1,000 other options that are being made available. So I think what that reflects is that the idea that an altar call per se would be a standard part of Methodist worship or United Methodist worship or even EUB worship on Sunday morning never really fully caught on. There's room for it, but it's not necessarily the thing that's going to happen, and so in many cases it won't. I hope that's been helpful. Remember, you can always contact me, worship@liturgyfolks.com, through our UMC Worship Facebook group, or drop a line on this page. And your question or comment may become the basis for a future episode of Q&A with Liturgy Man. The peace of Christ be always with you.